Like we do every episode, we're starting above the fold, and there's really only one story we need to talk about. Tiana, Donald Trump announced major plans for Washington, D.C. on Monday. What exactly was his announcement, and where do you think this leads us in terms of having a potentially militarized police force in the country?
Donald Trump has announced Liberation Day specifically for the nation's capital. He is invoking Section 740 of the DC Home Rule Act and deploying the National Guard to crack down on crime in DC. For some background here, in the Constitution, DC is supposed to be federally governed, and this was the case for most of the nation's history. It was then, like all terrible things about modernity, an LBJ plan that Richard Nixon executed to pass the DC Home Rule Act, which gives DC more local governance than it would have otherwise. Trump is using a stipulation in order to have more federal oversight, specifically as it pertains to crime, which, to be clear, remains a problem. Although violent crime has gone down, it peaked in 2023, it still remains astronomically above other major cities, right? We're looking at last year, we had a rate of 28 violent crimes per 100,000 residents, and specifically, Trump is focusing on juvenile crime. We had juvenile crime increase by 5% last year alone, so unlike the other forms of violent crime, it is not going down. Over the weekend, Trump's impending announcement could not have seemed any more prescient, and that was because down in Navy Yard, which historically is one of the more affluent, well-governed areas of the city, you had about 100 teenagers, young people, breaking out into a shooting. The city has imposed a curfew in that neighborhood. There are a couple curfews around town. But the major problem here is that the juvenile crime issue seems to totally defy all the other national trends. So now the question is how effective will this be? Is this situation unique in DC, or is this just Trump, trying to get one in on a blue city that he's in close proximity to?
It's interesting, and I think there isn't necessarily a straight answer. For the record, what Donald Trump is proposing, not even proposing, he's already done this, and he started doing it over the weekend. He mobilized 800 or so National Guard troops. He can do that legally, again, thanks to the Home Rule Act, in DC. He's also federalizing the Metropolitan Police Department. And, the devil's advocate argument here is that the district, for the last God knows how long, at least as long as I've been in DC, over a decade, the city and their progressive reforms when it comes to sentencing and criminal justice reform, they've not only not helped the problem, they've actually made it worse. Now, that being said, what Donald Trump also told us in this press conference is that he's considering doing this in places like New York City, Chicago, which would be illegal. He cannot use military assets as a police force inside the country. I think even some Democrats would admit the crime problem in DC is not tenable, right?
Yeah.
Like you mentioned before, violent crime is not going down like it is in states like New York or Illinois or even California to a lesser extent. But I do think this is part of Donald Trump's long-running feud, not only with Muriel Bowser, the mayor, who, believe it or not, has actually cozied up to Trump remarkably during the second term.
He's brought DC back. Highest metro ridership since, the pandemic.
Yeah.
So there are parts of it that are good for her. It could be a sticking point, though. So let's talk about the limitations of what Trump can do in DC.
Okay.
Because while the law enforcement element is crucial, Jeanine Pirro points out that although she's the DC prosecutor for adults, she cannot prosecute anyone under the age of 18 unless they are charged with rape, murder, even violent crimes that do not result in a death. She cannot prosecute. So it can stay in the wheelhouse of the local prosecutors. This has led some Republicans like Mike Lee to say, let's overturn or greatly amend DC Home Rule. One other element is truancy, which most of the statisticians who've been following this think that there is a direct correlation between DC's truancy rate and the youth crime issue in particular. So the Washington Post, again, not exactly a conservative outlet, They said that 16,000 kids in DC were classified as truant in the last school year. And truancy, that's 2 weeks of absences without an excuse. So that is not, I was sick and my mom called in, or I had to go to a family reunion and my dad called in. That is just, you do not show up. The 18,000 reports of truancy over the last 3 years went uninvestigated. DC public school truancy rate has more than doubled in the past decade, and I think this is the scariest stat. In the last school year, a third of all middle schoolers were truant, and the majority of high schoolers were truant. That is something I don't think anything with, as long as the Home Rule Act stands, there's nothing Trump can do about that, because
Correct.
that's all about that is not quite at the purview. Like, does Muriel Bowser need to break out her inner Kamala Harris and start jailing the parents of truant children?
I'm not going to comment on that, but I do think you're right. Like, this is one effort from Donald Trump, but it's not going to fix the problem entirely. It might potentially scare some of these kids into not carjacking random people or, whatever you have. But, like, this takes serious reforms, not only from the city, but potentially from Congress. I mean, Donald Trump is calling for legislation, which, for the record, let's be honest, has absolutely no chance of passing, that would effectively outlaw cashless bail at the federal level, which, again, you're going to need Democratic support for this. So, like, the way he is addressing this problem, I don't think is effective necessarily. He's pulling from his bag of tricks that he's used in the past. Mobilize the National Guard. It's shock and awe. And again, maybe it's a first step, but it feels to me very much like a slippery slope. In that press conference on Monday, you had Attorney General Pam Bondi, FBI Director Kash Patel, Jeanine Pirro, formerly a judge and, of course, a Fox News host, and the current district attorney in D.C., talking about this ends now. But then in the next breath, they're talking about we need help. And so, like, I just think this is a fallacy. And I say that because just last week, the White House itself was touting massive reductions in crime in every single city in the country in 2024. They thought the idea would be that, Donald Trump is restoring law and order, until they realized Donald Trump wasn't actually president in 2024. So this is an effort to, one, sort of take back the shine from the previous administration. But then again, we've talked about this at length, week after week after week on this show. They're hiding the ball. Donald Trump last week announced he's going to meet Vladimir Putin, which we're going to talk about later on Friday. We also on Monday got the notice that the grand jury testimony relating to Ghislaine Maxwell will not be unsealed as requested by the Justice Department. I just think this is like not specifically an issue that Trump should be focusing on right now. And I do think, again, the way that Democrats have moved on immigration to an extent over the last 2 years, the way they've started talking about crime in a different light, this is a wave that is already breaking, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, anything that comes from this isn't going to be specifically because Donald Trump sent 800 guardsmen into D.C. It's because the country as a whole, and even this city, which, again, has been democratically run forever, is realizing that what they've been doing wasn't working. Now, when we look at, I guess, and this is what scares me, the prospects of these policies being replicated in other parts of the country, specifically Chicago, specifically New York. Do you, as a conservative, as a, at least on this show, the card-carrying Trump supporter, right, does that not scare you at all?
I mean, it depends on to what end.
Okay.
If you are doing an ICE raid where you have reason to believe you have people who have been convicted of violent crimes or suspected ties to terrorist organizations, that seems obviously in the purview of the federal government, especially in the absence of local law enforcement being allowed to do the job. If you're just combating street crime, that could be different. Now, I just want to say on a personal level, I 100% welcome this for purely the selfish reason that I love DC. We work here. You live here. I live in Northern Virginia. I live on the DC subway system. I take it to work every single day. And I can honestly say the state of things has gotten dramatically better since Trump became president for a couple of reasons. But first and foremost, the return to office order has meant that the metro can't be just an open air drug den.
Yeah.
And there still is a lot of ways to go, because the fact is COVID broke this city in a way that it didn't break much of many other blue cities, right? New York City feels pretty much back. Downtown DC, where this office is pretty much a waste, right? So many storefronts that are just empty, old restaurants that have been shuttered and haven't been replaced. Some of that is, the work from home order, which Trump is fixing. Another part is crime, and another sense is just the general miasma of lawlessness, of pot scent everywhere, kids who are not in school, homeless vagabonds who take up all the benches at the park. It makes it so it is less livable in terms of just ways that the data can't even capture. It's just and I know I have been the victim of a violent crime in DC. I've been assaulted by a random person on the streets. This was before COVID. Called the police, no arrests made. One of my best friends who has been maced and attacked by, again, a group of truant girls, no arrests made.